It's the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has been in the news again recently, but this time not because of anything he did. Rather, the Guardian newspaper reported this week that the government of Ecuador spent about $66,000 per month over the past 6 years to ensure the security and surveillance of Assange in its embassy in London, where he has sought political asylum since 2012. Meanwhile, former President Rafael Correa responded to the Guardian report, saying in an interview with The Intercept that such expenses for someone like Assange are nothing unusual. The real scandal, Correa said, is Assange's treatment under Ecuador's current president, Lenin Moreno. Ever since March, Assange has been completely cut off from the outside world for allegedly breaking an agreement not to become involved in the political affairs of another country. Joining me now to analyze the most recent developments around Julian Assange is Guillaume Long. Guillaume is former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ecuador under former President Rafael Correa. Most recently, he was Ecuador's ambassador to the UN in Geneva under current President Lenin Moreno, but resigned last January because of political differences with the Moreno administration. Thanks for joining us again, Guillaume.
Thank you very much.
So let's first deal with the story about the security and surveillance that Ecuador spent on Assange. What's your reaction to this report, and does this expense seem justified?
Well, I mean, first of all, we'd have to have a look at the figures, where they got them from. You know, they keep talking about sources here and sources there. So I'd have to, before I actually comment on the actual figures, which weren't, these are figures from a different department, has to do with intelligence and security and so on. It wasn't directly under our administration, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But still, before we comment on that, I'd have to check how good these sources are. But even if it was all true, I have to agree with President Correa's initial answer. I mean, if you look at the Guardian article, it's basically describing it's obviously said in very kind of sensationalist language, but it's actually pretty obvious. If you have Julian Assange living in your embassy, then you're going to have security protocols. You're going to have they say they had CCTV cameras in their embassies. Well, probably most embassies have CCTV cameras, and it's said in a way that sounds like it's actually suspicious. But yes, of course, we had security personnel. We had security budget. So again, I would have to check whether the claims here are correct. And yes, I mean, let's not forget that Foreign Minister Haig back in 2012 threatened with storming the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And it was only the uproar that this caused in the international community and the total solidarity of pretty much every single Latin American state at the time that said they would breach every single article of international law having to do with diplomatic missions and diplomatic exchanges worldwide, that eventually the British government stood down. And in fact, there were a few embarrassed comments on behalf of Prime Minister Cameron, and this didn't happen. So, when you've been threatened that your embassy is going to be stormed, when you're surrounded by, in the first few years, very visible police personnel, I think it was over 60 police officers standing outside our embassy. I used to go in and out of our embassy, and you had to go past this kind of security filter. But even when they left, there was a very clear kind of presence of security services, intelligence services surrounding our embassy. So obviously, I mean, you have we had some security measures and protocols. I think it would have been irresponsible for us not to have these. Now, then there is a bit of the article that speculates whether we were actually spying on Assange, or that all this sounded pretty sensationalist to me. So those would be my first initial comments. Yes, we had a security operation. It was a responsibility for our own diplomatic personnel, because, as you know, Mr. Assange lives in an embassy where a number of Ecuadorian diplomats work on a daily basis. And, it's an embassy under siege. It's one of the great cases of harassment, long-standing contemporary harassment of a diplomatic mission in the world. So we had to do something about it, sure.
So turning to Assange's ongoing refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, Assange, as I said, has been completely cut off from the outside world since March this year, with no internet access at all. Also, it seems like most or almost all visitors have been denied. The formal explanation for this cutoff was that Assange violated an agreement when he got involved in the politics of Spain by expressing support for Catalan separatists. When you were foreign minister, Assange's communication was also cut off for a few weeks during the US presidential campaign. What's your reaction to the way this communications cutoff is currently being handled by the Moreno government?
Yes, I think the Moreno government has kind of made the most of the fact that we did it once. As you said, during the US elections in 2016, we decided to cut off Julian's internet because we felt that there was a risk that there could be an interpretation that Ecuador was being used. Sovereign jurisdiction of Ecuador, our diplomatic mission in the UK, was being used in the context of the US elections, was being used in order to kind of meddle in US elections. So we didn't want anybody to think that or to interpret that. So we cut off Julian's internet. It was a short-lived measure. It was specific. It had to do with the US election. And as soon as the elections were over, he was reconnected. This was it was a difficult decision to make. It created some conflict, but I think it was made in a very in a very serious context, the context of the US elections, and using the kind of following rationale. We wouldn't want the US, we haven't wanted the US or any great power to meddle in our elections in the past. It was only fair that Ecuadorian territory, Ecuadorian jurisdiction shouldn't be used by anybody to meddle in any other country's elections. So that was the rationale then. I feel that what the Moreno government's done now is kind of say this has been done before, we can do it again, but in a very irresponsible manner, because there's no real reason to do this again. The reasons which have been given are kind of ridicule compared to the context of US elections. I mean, I think Assange's internet has been cut off because of his tweets, or I think probably a couple of tweets on the Catalan issue. It's not exactly the same as the weight that the Podesta mails had on the Clinton campaign. I think really there's a big difference there. And it's not just his internet that's being cut off, it's all his communication. So we're seeing his limited access. He's almost living in isolation now in the embassy with no visits allowed. Now, this is pretty extreme. One thing is cutting his internet for 2 or 3 weeks, and another thing is cutting his internet with open-endedly, because there's been no promise on behalf of Ecuador, no indication at all that they're going to reconnect him one day, for something absolutely minor, or certainly much more minor than what the internet was cut for in the past, and cutting him access from interacting with other human beings. I mean, he's already been in a very sort of a difficult situation, isolated in that embassy, and Ecuador's made it significantly more difficult. So, and again, if you read the communique, there is no sign of Ecuador connecting him again, and there's a big contrast with the past communique when Ecuador actually said, we're going to do this, it's going to be cut off during the elections, but we absolutely ratify the asylum. This got nothing to do with the human rights issue here. Julian Assange is still at risk. We still believe that there may be a case of political persecution. Therefore, the asylum is guaranteed. Well, this time round, we're actually seeing the Moreno administration saying, and we reserve the right to take further measures. There's been no guarantee in the last few weeks and months that the Moreno administration would maintain the asylum. And in fact, I think we're seeing the asylum being more and more under threat, more and more jeopardized. And I think we're now facing serious risk that the Ecuadorian government might put an end to the asylum to Julian Assange. So, yeah, I think it's a very different context, and it's much more serious and worrying for the security and well-being of Julian Assange himself.
Yeah, actually, I was wondering about that. I mean, as a political refugee, I mean, presumably he's taking asylum precisely because his political rights in other parts of the world are being denied. And so I'm just wondering what the logic is of denying somebody their political rights to freedom of expression while they're in the embassy, whereas the issue of interfering, well, I mean, there's one issue, which is the political expression as a form of interference, but another is actually releasing confidential material in order, or not in order, but that could potentially influence an election. It seems like you said, very different issues. But in this case, there are particular rights that are being infringed. And I'm just wondering now, finally, what do you think might happen? You said that his right to asylum might be denied entirely. I mean, what kind of evidence do you see for that? In what direction? I mean, why might that be happening? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, first, let me just agree. I think last time we were facing leaks that were having a big impact on the election. Yeah? We could debate. I mean, it wasn't an easy decision, and I know a lot of people were against it. And we could debate whether Ecuador reacted accordingly or not, whether it should have cut off his email, whether it shouldn't. We can have a debate on that. And you know, it wasn't an easy one. But this time, it's completely disproportionate response. It's because of some tweets. There are no leaks. There are no major events happening, elections that are being, you know, that Ecuador could possibly feel that it's in an awkward diplomatic position. And it's sheer, you can see that it's Moreno who doesn't like the fact that Julian Assange is in the embassy and is using any kind of pretext, any kind of thing that he can cling on to kind of crack down and make it an uncomfortable situation for Julian, and maybe even kind of try through making his life hell to put a premature end to Ecuador's granting of the asylum. So answering this, your latest question, I mean, I think clearly the Moreno administration is moving back into the US fold in terms of hemispheric geopolitics, is moving away from the kind of progressive foreign policy. We've seen a lot of things in the last few weeks that indicate that Moreno is cozying up to the United States. We've seen an important Southcom mission going to Ecuador in order to kind of renew its involvement in accompanying Ecuador in terms of Ecuador's security concerns. This is, I think, in breach of Ecuador's sovereignty. One of the great advances of the Correa government administration was to recuperate control over its security and its intelligence services, which is something that Ecuador had lost, and it would basically in the hands of the United States. And I feel that with the Moreno administration and a few things that have happened now on the border between Ecuador and Colombia, you're seeing the US coming back and gradually gaining more and more power and more influence in all sorts of regards, economic also, but also within the kind of state apparatus and the security and intelligence networks of Ecuador. So I think, I mean, I don't know what's going on, what kind of conversations they're having between the Moreno administration and the Trump administration, but I would have thought it was very likely that there was US pressure happening there. And if Moreno wants to show goodwill to the United States, I mean, who knows what he's promising? And we're certainly seeing, with this crackdown, cutting the internet, but also cutting all communications, and with the general tone that's been employed by the foreign minister, by several ministers, by Moreno himself, that the asylum is under threat. It's not just opposition to the kinds of things that Julian Assange has said that we're hearing from the Ecuadorian government. It's actually the Ecuadorian government not promising, for the first time in 6 years, we're not hearing the Ecuadorian government saying the asylum is guaranteed. We will guarantee the asylum until we are certain that there is no more risk to Julian Assange's physical integrity, security, until we know that there is no more political persecution. But Ecuador's refusing to say this. Ecuador's being very quiet on that front. So it's using threats, but it's not reassuring either Julian Assange or the international community that Julian Assange's asylum is guaranteed.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there for now. I'm speaking to Guillaume Long, former Foreign Minister of Ecuador. Thanks again, Guillaume, for having joined us today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.